I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate. I've got this game running at 165 frames a second, so I'm maximising that, so to speak. So in terms of the benefits of this, you've got the monitor pumping out up to 2.75 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. That greatly improves the connected feel. That refers to the fluidity and the connectedness, the precision you feel when you interact with the game world. This is something which low input lag will also aid, and this monitor has fairly low input lag, not super low. I measured 4.5 milliseconds. This takes into account both the signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel, as well as an element of pixel response, which is a fair contributor on this model. So it does indicate a fairly low signal delay, fairly low input lag. Most people are going to be quite happy with this aspect of the monitor. The other aspect of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a concept explored in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness. It's also summarised a bit in the written review in the responsiveness section, so if you're not familiar with this, do check that out. I also talk about pursuit photography, which is a method to capture motion on a monitor in a way that accurately represents what the eye sees. So most of it comes from the movement of your eyes as you view a monitor, and that's very tightly linked to the refresh rate. So increasing the refresh rate helps in this respect, greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. And the other aspect is pixel responsiveness. So they're both important. So I'm going to put some pursuit photographs on the screen with this monitor running at 165Hz. You can see here that there are definitely some weaknesses in terms of its pixel responsiveness. And this is only looking at a fairly slim number of transitions. I will consider a broader range of transitions. That's why I like to show games like this as well. And I do talk about this subjectively in the written review. But just looking at these transitions, you can see some smeary trailing in places, particularly for the dark background, which is the top UFO. And you can see it a bit for the middle background, the medium shade, medium cyan background. But there's not really any smeary trailing to speak of with the light background. You can also see the different response time settings. So there's off, normal, fast, and faster. The differences between the response time settings, they're not massive, and actually with the transitions shown here, they're not really that easy to see. But what I will tell you is that the faster setting gives you a lot of overshoot, really bright, eye-catching halo trailing. For some transitions not shown here, this is really in your face, and I hate the setting for that reason. I really can't bear to use it. I'm fairly sensitive to overshoot, but even if you weren't particularly sensitive to it, I think you'd find this quite annoying. So you'd probably want to use one of the other settings. And fast and normal, they're really quite similar. It's just that normal tends towards slightly lower overshoot, but with some pixel transitions performed a bit slower. Fast speeds up those pixel transitions, so reduces your conventional trailing a little bit, whilst increasing overshoot just slightly. These are really marginal differences in my opinion, but I prefer the overall balance with the fast setting, so that's what I've settled on here, what I'm going to be using. Also, if you notice the last and the second last column of this test, you'll see that there are some reference screens. The first one is a VA reference, that is the AOC CQ32G3SU, which is a reasonably fast VA model, not particularly fast, but I'd say it's actually slightly above average. And if you compare to that, you'll see that if anything, the VA reference screen there is slightly faster than this LG for these particular transitions, except for the light background where it's slightly slower. And that's just a theme when you look at the transitions more generally, that there are some transitions that this LG will perform a little bit faster, some that it'll perform a little bit slower. But the overall experience, I'd say, between the two models is quite similar when it comes to pixel responsiveness. There's also an IPS reference right at the end there, the AOC 24GQ50F-B, and this is just significantly faster and consistently faster. For the transition shown here, and just more broadly, it is a faster model. So I don't want you to become too downtrodden by the fact there are weaknesses here. There are weaknesses with all VA models, even the very fastest ones. The Samsung Odyssey G7 and above still have some slight weaknesses, but they are certainly more minor on those high-end Odyssey models. But many VA models, if you look at budget models like this, most of them are actually slower. And if you look at models which are a bit more expensive than this LG, quite a lot of them are actually slower as well. So the LG does push things quite well with its fast setting. in terms of reducing some of this smeary trailing. And really just, you know, there's sort of a mask of extra perceived blur when I move around here. For example, there are mainly light to medium shades, but there's certainly darker shades mixed in, quite a lot of shadow detail going on even in this scene. And again, there's that extra mask of perceived blur because of what I describe as powdery trailing, which can be a bit of a heavy powdery trail in places. It does add to perceived blur overall. But with some VA models, I'd move around here and the dark brickwork with the medium shades in the background and some of the lighter shades in the background, there would actually be more pronounced smears that would really extend like a kind of smoky trail on some VA models, but you don't get that on this one. Slightly smeary look to the white text and the white icon there with the darker shades or the medium to dark shades in the background. Again, it's not super smeary, but there's a bit of a powdery trail. I call it a heavy powdery trail here. It also has a slightly green quality to it. If you change the color temperature of the monitor, or you have it set up differently, that can change the colors that you might see here, the sort of tints to these trails. Can change that a little bit. But overall, not super colorful here, just a little bit of that powdery trailing going on. In terms of overshoot, it isn't extreme at 165 Hz. There is a bit behind the wall here with the sky in the background. It's probably not going to come across on the video because it isn't extreme overshoot. But it's a little bit brighter than the background, so it stands out a bit for that reason. Also around the tree trunk, perhaps a little bit clearer around the tree trunk to my eye at least. And again, this can have a little bit of a colourful appearance to it, slightly green or cyan in places. Depends on the transitions being performed, but it's not bright, colourful overshoot like some VA models will show. And this isn't really overshoot so much as a little bit of a, I wouldn't really say smeary, but sort of a heavy powdery trail around the post there. Might not necessarily be able to see that on the video because it isn't a defined smeary trail or anything like that. And the sweat starts pouring down their faces if they've seen my videos before. Yes, the horrible, horrible, horrible transitions with smear all over the place. Now, it's not actually that bad, but this scene does have a lot of dark transitions, dark shades, so transitions involving these darker shades, and these are transitions which VA models like this do struggle with. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, there are weaknesses, some smeary trailing around the flags there, the boats down there, the canoes, bit of smeary trailing, not too bad actually. Sometimes when I circle the mouse like this, I know some people think, oh, this is such an artificial movement, you're not going to be playing the game and doing that kind of thing. Perhaps not, but actually I'm just trying to show these particular weaknesses. You can see them to the eye with linear movements as well. It just comes across in a more obvious way on the video when I circle like this. But sometimes it really has a smoky appearance and it extends really far from the canoe here. This definitely does look smeary, but it isn't as bold or as extensive as on some VA models. So yeah, definitely weaknesses which are highlighted here. The makeshift roof is a good one for highlighting these as well. And also a little bit of a sort of muddy green colour coming out here as well. And again, the actual colour you would see, it depends on the transitions being performed, the exact shades in the background and for the object. And also it depends on how you've got the monitor set up in terms of its colour balance. So mine is targeted to 6500K white point. If you have it set to a cooler point than that, you might not notice this muddy green so much. It might be a bit more blended, but it isn't an extreme tint anyway, just something I like to point out. Another thing I like to point out is that on some VA models, these weaknesses aren't always defined smeary trails. And if I look at this bush here, it's a conglomeration of shades with dark shades and sort of medium dark shades or slightly brighter shades mixed in. And when I move, the brighter shades darken up a bit, and when I cease the movement, they return to their correct state. They brighten up. So this can appear as a sort of flickering, depending on the movement patterns in the game or with your mouse or your controller. This isn't a super defined shift in this case. It doesn't become way darker during movement and then brighten up loads. So it doesn't really look like a defined flickering effect in this case. So it's not a supreme weakness, but it does happen a little bit. And to help explore these weaknesses in a slightly more specific way, I'm going to be using good old Twitter on the desktop. So I'm just going to be giving some desktop examples. I know that not everyone will game on their monitor all the time. I spend a lot of my time not gaming as well as a bit of time gaming, mixed use. So we will see some weaknesses on the desktop as well. For dark text against a bright background, plenty of content like that on the internet, there aren't really any distinct weaknesses. Some powdery trailing in places, particularly around the images, but that's really a mixture of shades, not just pure black. But nothing that really stands out in a super obvious, annoying way, in my opinion. So for this kind of content, it's fine. With the lights out mode now, the weaknesses are more defined. So you've got a dark background, light text, but nothing that I really describe as an obvious smeary trail here. And as you move the mouse, you will see this light grey text, or you can see, when you scroll, or if you move the window, you can see this light grey text there blend into the black, a bit like I was showing you with that bush with the flickering effect. With the middle setting, which is called dim, that's where more distinct weaknesses occur, and there is smeary trailing in places. If I just start moving the window like this, it might become a bit more apparent. But around the image there, around my logo, around the text, yep, there is a smeary trail. Not super extended, not super bold, but it is there, around the icons there as well. Hopefully will come across on the video, not always easy to show, but I'm just pointing out that when you're on the desktop, you can also notice some of these weaknesses. This monitor does support VRR. It has a variable refresh rate. Adaptive sync is used. That includes AMD FreeSync Premium as an AMD user. And you can also use Nvidia's G-Sync compatible mode with a compatible Nvidia GPU. That's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 plugged in at the moment. And the experience was very similar that I tested with my Nvidia GPU and also my AMD GPU using AMD FreeSync Premium. Very similar experience in both cases. Something I'm very pleased to note is that there isn't really an issue with VRR flickering on this model. Usually VA models will have some kind of issue here, and I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because it isn't an issue here, but I've got a thread on my forum talking a bit more about this, and it's certainly something I raise when it is an issue, and actually some OLED models have an issue with it as well. So I was really pleased to see that it isn't an issue here. It's sort of very minor flickering with very heavy fluctuations in frame rate, but there's nothing which really jumps out at you. And even when it passes the LFC boundary, low frame rate compensation, there isn't a defined flickering. So this monitor has, they will claim a 48 to 165 Hz VRR range, but in my testing it's more like 55 Hz to 165 Hz. So when it goes below that 55 Hz or thereabouts, LFC kicks in, so it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So say your game is running at 40 frames a second, it's not going to go to 40 Hz because that's below the floor of operation, but it can go to 80 Hz, which is a multiple, and that will keep tearing and stuttering at bay. So yes, the technology does work very well to keep tearing and stuttering at bay from these frame and refresh rate mismatches. Oh, and just to quickly mention, when you pass the LFC boundary, so around 55 Hz in my testing in either direction, there isn't flickering, or isn't really noticeable flickering, but you do get some stuttering, slight stuttering, and that's something which isn't specific to this model, but something which I observe much more broadly, and it isn't as obvious as the stuttering you'd get from normal frame and refresh rate mismatches, but it's something to be aware of if you are particularly sensitive to that and you're frequently passing the boundary. I've got the monitor running now at 120 Hz, so my game is running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is at 120 Hz. The trailing behaviour's changed now, so as I mentioned, the pixel response requirements are reduced now with this reduced refresh rate. The powdery trailing is reduced. It is still there in places, and yes, you can see it around the boat, so I can certainly see it around the boat to my eye a bit, and around the flag there, a bit of a smeary trail, and just the general perceived blur. There's a little bit of a mask of extra perceived blur, but not as pronounced as it was at 165 Hz. But there's also an increase in overshoot. So you might be able to see that on the video, even sort of slightly colourful halo trailing, so that's brighter than the background and stands out a bit for that reason. So it's sort of a mix of this smeary trailing in places, with some overshoot in places. So I wouldn't say it's ideal if you're sensitive to this kind of thing, but it's not terrible for VA at all at this kind of refresh rate. With some models, and quite often actually, there will be more pronounced smeary trails. So it works reasonably well, I'd say, at 120 Hz. Not perfect though. IPS, reference IPS model I showed you, that's not even a particularly fast IPS model actually, but even that does offer you a superior performance here. And when I say it's not particularly fast, I should say it's not slow, it's just that it isn't the fastest out there. And I used it as a reference for that reason, because it's at a level which most are very comfortable with. So some people will be happy to game with these weaknesses. Other people, they'll find them a bit annoying. I've now got the game running at 100 frames a second, so the monitor's running at 100 Hz. The overshoot does become more pronounced now. There is, I find it quite eye-catching actually, even when I'm not specifically looking for it. Even compared to 120 Hz, I do feel it's sort of moderately strong now. If you want to reduce this, you might think, well, I could change to the normal overdrive setting. So I've just switched over to the normal response time setting, and that does reduce it a little bit, but to be honest, it's still almost as eye-catching. Doesn't really make a huge difference, and there's a slight increase in the powder trailing as well in places, but not really too much. Actually, really the two settings give you a very similar performance. So if you find it bothersome on one, you're going to find it bothersome with the other setting. You can eliminate it by switching the response time to off. So goodbye overshoot, but hello extreme smeary trailing. And I should actually mention at this point that some VA models will always look like this, or roughly like this, even with a strong overdrive setting. So to put things in perspective, this monitor is actually quite decent for a VA panel, but there are still weaknesses to be aware of, and this offsetting is almost making me feel a bit sick. It's like this sort of extra filter on the game to simulate drunkenness or something like that. It's not wonderful. To be honest, I would take a bit of overshoot over this personally. I've now got things running at 80 Hz, 80 frames a second, and I'm still using the offsetting, and even at 80 frames a second, there are really distinct weaknesses, even though the pixel response requirements are much lower now than they were at 165 Hz, for example, and significantly lower even compared to 120 Hz. And yeah, it just isn't keeping up at all with the requirements here. A lot of smeary trailing all over the place. Not nice, so I'm going to switch over to my preferred fast setting. I'm not going to bother showing you normal because it's very similar to fast. So now there is quite a lot of overshoot, and you might even be conflicted between using that off setting, which wasn't really very nice because of the smeary trailing all over the place, and this fast setting, which largely eliminates the smeary trailing. There's not really anything I would describe as smeary. There is actually a little bit for the wood there with the dark shades or medium dark shades in the background. A bit of that going on, but it's really the overshoot which is the more obvious issue here. So what I would have liked to have seen is normal being a setting which is somewhere between off and fast, rather than it being really very close to fast. To really sort of complete this and hammer this home, I've now got the game running at 60 frames a second, 60 Hz, super bright halo trailing. It's going to be very obvious on the video, I would hope, around the makeshift roof, for example. And I'm just going to switch to the normal setting, just to show you that it's still there in pretty much all its glory. And then the off setting for completeness. You guessed it, smeary trailing all over the place, but the overshoot has gone. But there's nothing between these two extremes. And if you are spending a lot of time in these double digits and you're really conflicted between the off setting and the normal or fast setting, I completely understand that, because these two extremes, neither of them are particularly great. Then you might even want to just disable VRR and put up with the tearing and stuttering. It's not ideal, and it's a shame that users have to really choose between these two. But really this monitor seems to be quite heavily optimized for the much higher refresh rates, and less optimization, less thought given to the lower refresh rates. If you're rarely here, rarely in these double-digit refresh rates, or rarely 100 Hz or below, or really much below 120 Hz, then just stick to fast, be happy. Yes, there are some weaknesses and all that, but I think the offsetting is much worse. Whereas down here, there's a bit of a conflict between which setting to use, and nothing is really anywhere close to perfect. Speaking of not close to perfect, the monitor also includes a strobe backlight setting called 1 millisecond motion blur reduction. That is something which is explored in the written review in quite a bit of detail, probably more detail than I really had to, because I didn't like the setting in this case, because there was a lot of strobe crosstalk. There are some distinct weaknesses due to some pixel response time weaknesses causing obvious fragments of trailing, and for that reason it didn't really deliver the kind of experience I'd hoped to see from a strobe backlight setting. Even if you quite like to use this kind of setting usually, I'm not sure if you will on this model.